we're catching up with DC of the Capstone Report. Before we do that, pay a quick couple bills here. Hey, we've been talking about golf, and we'll get back to that conversation if you want to go back there on the Mickelson versus Deflategate. But if you're wanting to work on your game so you don't have the frustrating moments like Phil Mickelson had, then go out to Old Colony Golf Course. Old Colony Golf Course. Go check them out right there. The home of champions of the University of Alabama men's and women's golf teams play there. And if you want to get your game back up to par, then go check them out at Old Colony Golf Course. June special, Monday through Thursday. Twilight begins at 10 a.m. $39 for a round with cart and play all day. That's $39 for a round with cart, play all day. The Twilight special at Old Colony Golf Course. Let's bring in DC of the DC Report. Good morning, DC. How you doing?
Doing great, Martin. How are you this morning?
Doing well. Hey, listen, sorry for getting to you a little late this morning, but I went through my normal run through and wasn't expecting as much interaction. I was just really on my own personal soapbox with the Deflategate versus Phil Mickelson, the rolling putt, making the comparison and how people are saying that's going to change one's legacy and not a big deal about letting air out of the ball. And of course, I disagree with that. So I apologize for just not getting to you, but I know that we got a great conversation set for this morning. Let's get right into it. The NCAA has been known to not make very many rules to benefit players. But between the SEC grad transfer rule and now the last two rules by the NCAA, things you're looking up if you're a player, or are they really looking up when it comes to the rule? Let's first of all talk about the NCAA rule in terms of notification transfers versus permission transfers. What's your takeaway on that one?
Well, I mean, I think of course, they benefit the player, but in reality, they're going to benefit the schools. I think the schools are going to use them to their advantage. I think the being able to transfer. I think not being able to block a transfer. I think that's going to be a rule that's beneficial to the player. Of course, I think it'll eventually help the schools as well down the road. Other players transferring in, but I think the most important rule coming out of this that's probably going to affect the game and affect the dynamic of how the game is played is the new redshirt transfer rule.
Okay, so when you look at it, is it just? Do you think? Let me ask it this way: do you think it's possible that they could potentially go back and change the notification plus the sit out for one full year? Because I think right now it will help them in the fact that they're going to put this into a database. They're going to put the player notifies the coach and they put them in a database, which means now the players don't have to reach out and contact anyone. The coaches from the other schools can contact them, but they still have to set out a year. Do you see them potentially changing that rule, or do you think that's going to stay in place?
I think for a little while that'll stay in place. I think changing the other rules that they've changed this year, they believe, and I think the players do believe benefits them. But I think that on the horizon, that might be something you see. That sitting out rule sometimes can be very harsh for a player. I think eventually down the road you might see that rule change. I don't think so in the next year or two, maybe a couple of years down the road.
All right. Now, another rule was the big red shirt rule, and that red shirt rule has ramifications that are extremely good. I think this is the first time in a long time, in my opinion, the NCAA has actually made a win-win rule for programs, coaches, and most of all players. What's your thoughts on the red shirt rule?
I agree with you on this, Martin. When I read this rule, looking at the other ideas that were on the table, this came out to be to the best benefit. I think it's a two-way street benefit here, benefit to the player and plus a benefit to the school. And I think when you look at the surface, you think, well, it's going to be great. The players get to play for at least 4 games during the season. But I think this makes a bigger impact than that when you look at the whole overall picture of the game and how it's played. Now, not only while you're looking at players being able to play 4 games, but you have opportunities to really get freshmen playing time that would have normally been on your redshirt list and would not get any playing time. And so you'd burn them if you played them. You remember years ago, Alabama was going into a championship game with one quarterback, and they had the potential to burn the red shirt on A.J. McCarron, so he wouldn't have had the full years of eligibility that he had they been an injury. Well, with this 4-game redshirt rule, they won't. That will change the landscape of being able to play someone in place of an injury, of course. But the investment into the freshmen that the team will be able to make as far as playing 4 games during the season and developing them, it's one thing about practice time and scout team time. It is a different thing when you get into a game playing either against non-conference opponents or conference opponents in the SEC and just getting up to the speed of the game. I think that gives a great advantage of some experience for some freshmen that ordinarily would not have gotten to play under the old redshirt rule. So I think it's going to be strategic. I think the teams are going to have to put into place a process, a strategy in order how to do this and how to take well advantage of this redshirt rule. For the player, it opens up a whole realm of possibilities. For the team itself. It does as well. It allows you to be strategic in games, players that you play in games. And then I think it can affect some overall position battles because
hold that thought right there. I want you to hold that thought about position battles and the impact there. And I totally agree. We're going to go ahead and get the break here, but I totally agree with you that you actually have the ability to get players and keep them engaged because you have to understand every guy that's coming to Alabama was a superstar on their team. And they go from being the man and playing every snap and only coming out when they want to having to watch and think they may go in or to actually not even traveling, not even being an active, engaged part. And I think that's going to pay huge dividends. You brought up something, you mentioned position battles, and we're going to talk about coming back on the other side. We're going to continue our conversation with DC and the Capstone Report presented by Golden Shores Production right here on the Blitz, talking about the potential of the red shirt rule and its impact on position battles right here at home and even into the future. And we're now back in with DC and the Capstone Report presented by Golden Shores Production. I have a weekly podcast that you can find right there at Golden Shores Production. But we get a little preview of what's to come right here on the Blitz each and every Monday. DC, checking back in with you. As we were going to break there, you mentioned that this red shirt rule could have some impact on position battles. Speak to that in general. And, of course, I'm sure there's one position battle that you've already seen some ramifications for it potentially here at Bama.
Yeah, yes, Martin. I think in general, though, this is going to be a big thing for Alabama and most other colleges, too. As you know, in playing football, it's one thing when you're in practice to go up against an opponent battling for position. You get in certain reps, trying to even out the reps. But when you're a freshman and you're coming in, you can compete at a high level. You stay in, like you said a while ago, stay engaged throughout the whole practice leading up to the games. But realizing that now you're going to get to carry that position battle on into the season and play in games. Translating to the field is a big thing for a freshman and for keeping up with the speed of the game. So I look for freshmen to be able to compete during these 4 games for battles, position battles all across the SEC. At Alabama, specifically looking, I think this is going to benefit on the offensive line. When you have an offensive line shakeup coming back in, and, we've often had times in the early games where our offensive line hasn't gelled. You hadn't got that position group that you want in there. Now you've got some freshmen that could come in that could contribute, and they get to get in the mix in that, play in at least 4 of those games and try to get your best offensive lineman on the field. I think it's going to benefit Alabama this next year.
DC, when you
put together that line.
When you look at, speaking of the offensive line battle, this past year, Womack ended up winning that position. But how many times did you hear, man, Jedrick Wills, he has some serious potential. But what people don't understand is if the playbook's 3 inches thick, a freshman, by the time the first game comes along, has really probably learned 1 inch of that book, maybe. And so your offensive is sometimes limited and things like that. So, but if you had the opportunity and the potential to play that kid without there being any loss of his eligibility, you're right. I hadn't even thought about it to that degree. How many times we've had just at Alabama where an offensive lineman could have got in the mix and potentially solidified himself in live game action.
Exactly. Jedrick Wills is a great case to think about. Also, Alex Leatherwood. We see them both show up in the national championship game and hold their own against some quality SEC opponents. But two things to remember: those freshmen were going up against probably the best defensive outside linebackers in the nation in Alabama in the practices they were going against.
Yeah.
And it's great to see them against other competition, to put everything in perspective, compare. When you see them going against the number one team on Alabama and practice and maybe getting beat a time or two and they're in a position battle, yet you get to put them in 4 games and look at the whole body of work on how they held up against other players. It makes a difference, I think. I think you'll see some of those linemen be able to compete and get some consistency. Learn the playbook and learn to play with others. Playing on the offensive line it means you got to play with others to make it look good. Everybody look good. Everybody's got to play together. So I think it's going to be a big help. When I
look back at that rule, I hadn't even thought about this, but my freshman year when I came here, DC, and as you was talking about this, first time I really thought about it in regards to this rule, I came in as a freshman, had a really, really good summer, but the week of the game, the week of the season when we started to go into the game plan, Coach Curry called me into his office, and this is what he said. He says, Martin, you're good enough to play. He said, you're good enough to play as a true freshman. Right now, you could help this team. The problem is there's 3 or 4 guys in front of you, and if I play you, you lose a year. So do you want to be redshirted or do you want to try to fight it out? Well, that's a tough choice to make as an 18-year-old. But if he had in his pocket, he could have played me for 2 or 3 games, 4 games, and it wouldn't have done anything but help me. And it would have helped him answer the question of whether or not I could contribute at a higher level in action. It just makes that decision easier. And I know this is a little different, but when we look at Nick Saban and having to try to decide on a quarterback, even how big of an advantage is this rule for Nick Saban in making this decision?
Yeah, I agree, Mark. And just to go back to what you just said about you and Coach Curry, it not only makes it easier for you to make that decision, it makes it more fair for you to be able to have a 4-game to show your whole body of work against other competition, and it makes it fair for the coach to make that decision. But I think it's going to be a benefit. I think it's going to be a big benefit to the whole system. But yes, going into Alabama quarterback, everybody wants to talk about that position battle, and I think this red shirt rule does nothing but help Alabama football in that. And you can look at all the nuances and look at either side on who wins or who doesn't win. But in reality, you have 2 players now that gets to go on into the season and play at least 4 games to try to win the team. And a lot of times, winning of the team in the past, you can point to games where Greg McElroy won the team or A.J. McCarron won the team or Blake Sims won over the team. It happened in games when they actually came out and did something. So I think you'll have this quarterback competition going into the season, and with either quarterback being able to win the team. Well, whichever one doesn't, there's a possibility now that they could play 4 games and still be redshirt. There's a possibility, if Jalen Hurts doesn't win the job over Tua, it's a possibility that to his advantage, he gets to play 4 games in the season. He gets to be redshirted. Strategically, you can play 3 games and have an extra game to play in case of an injury. And he gets to be redshirted. In his case, it works to his advantage because in December he gets to graduate, and then he can transfer out with 2 years of eligibility after playing at Alabama. The other is true as well with Tua. If he doesn't win the starting quarterback battle in practice over Jalen Hurts, if he doesn't separate himself, he gets to separate himself in practice. I mean, in the game now for at least 4 games or or less. But even if he doesn't separate himself, and Jalen Hurts wins the quarterback position, then Tua has a more incentive to stay at Alabama and be redshirted with an extra year of eligibility to stay there and play with his brother on a team that they haven't been able to do that in the past as much. So, I look for – there's all kind of nuances to this quarterback rule. It's a lot of ifs and buts. And I guess you just got to wait and see how it plays out. But I think this redshirt rule is going to have a say in ultimately defining how the quarterback situation in Alabama turned out, and opens a path for both players to stay and play, which would really enhance Alabama's chances going forward.
Speaking with DC of the Capstone Report, and we got a couple of people on Facebook making some comments. I'll get you to respond to it. Larry Miller saying, so when they redshirt, it saves them a season for when they transfer. Yes, and that's going to, I think, with this new grad transfer rule, is going to be a direct impact of those two rules passing together, redshirt and grad transfer rules. But Robert Saucier, and this is where I want to get you to comment. Robert Saucier said, make no mistake, though, they passed this rule because it would help everyone else not named Alabama. Do you see the other schools benefiting any more than Alabama would? And if so, why or why not?
Well, I see the other schools benefiting because you're going to get if that side of the coin says, hey, Alabama's going to have some top-notch talent that can't play here, so they're going to go and transfer somewhere else. And other schools are going to benefit. But, hey, I say this to that, and that's a great comment, but I say this, make no mistake about it. Nick Saban will always find a way to make the advantage go in Alabama's way, and I believe he will in this case. Yeah. I just think this actually opens up Alabama to, if they want to go after a transfer, if they want to sign someone, this is another way that they get to do that from another team, and I think he will find a way to work this in his advantage.
Well, you look at flipping back over to the red shirt rule real quick, DC. When you look at a guy that played against Oklahoma, just think about how much sooner you think guys would get on the field, or guys who end up getting redshirted at Alabama would actually get on the field. Because what people don't realize is the reality of it is Alabama will report, and you have about 2 weeks and potentially some change to win a job if you're a freshman. Because after that, they're now getting ready to get game ready. And if you don't know the playbook and you hadn't got that playbook down, it's kind of crazy to think that a kid can come in and play. Now you still have into the season. So you could potentially, everybody's saying you won't see a guy that misses the first 2 or 3 games, then all of a sudden come out and play. And that is absolutely totally wrong. Guys like that come from these small schools that don't have the type of playbook and organization could easily be guys that miss the first 2 or 3 games but work their way into playing time at a big level. DC, go ahead.
Let me say one thing I don't think anybody else has thought about or talked about, and I think you will understand it when I tell you this. You'll immediately hear it, and it'll a lot to go off. There's another potential advantage to Alabama in all of this, and that is this. On today's podcast, Gary and I are going to highlight probably the most unheralded part of the Alabama staff, and that is Jeff Allen and the athletic trainers. Jeff Allen, in my opinion, and others share this same opinion, is the reason that we won some of the ball games in 2017 after those rash of injuries that took place. And also in 2016, he's the reason we won some games. And going back as far as Kenyon Drake getting injured and coming back for the national championship game that made a difference in that game in 2015. But
a lot of people don't know that story about Kenyon and him developing the Kevlar cast that was able to allow Kenyon Drake. They actually invented a specific type of cast for him to play in that game. But go ahead.
That's right. Kenyon Drake trusted him so much because of his help on his leg when he broke it against Mississippi. He trusted him so much that walking off the field when he broke his arm, he was already talking to Jeff Allen about getting back on the field for the SEC championship game. And walking off the field, that was his goal. Well, they got a 3D printed Kevlar carbon cast, 3D printed by the engineering department.
Yeah.
Put it on his hand. He came in. He catches the first pass in the SEC championship game, and we all know the rest of the story. He thinks that he takes that ball all the way back in the Clemson game without that return. I don't think it breaks Clemson's will in that game. And in that picture that's will go down in history is him pushing that Kevlar cast across the goal line.
Right.
And the first person he came to afterwards was Jeff Allen and hugged him after that play. So what I'm saying is here's the advantage, Martin. You got Alabama with a great staff like that gets people back on the field faster. We have a catastrophic or have an injury that hurts one of our best players, and you got a great freshman that sitting behind them is not going to play. They're going to redshirt because that player is so fantastic, and maybe the second team is a really good player as well. Now you don't have to burn a red shirt. You got a great training staff like Alabama that we've seen them get them back on the field in 2-3 games. You can go in and play a couple of games and play your all out without any worry about losing your red shirt now. And that's going to be a tactical, strategic advantage to the University of Alabama. I don't care who everybody says about this rule. Saban will use that to his advantage. There'll come a time where the whole process, Jeff Allen will be working on getting a player back on the field in a couple of games, and that freshman's going to come in. He's going to make an impact that makes a difference in some ball games. You can write that down. I think that's going to happen to give Alabama an advantage.
That is DC of the Capstone Report presented by Golden Shores Production. A little preview of what they're going to have on the podcast. Also going to be talking about outside linebackers, specifically Terrell Lewis, Christian Miller, amongst other things. You can find that podcast to be up later on this afternoon at Golden Shores Production. DC, thanks for hanging around for an extra segment with me this morning, and we'll catch up with you on next week. Let our listeners know how they can follow you and stay in touch with you.
Well, you can catch the podcast at goldenshoresproductions.com. That's goldenshoresproductions.com. And then also you can follow me on Twitter at David Cott, DAVIDCOT 50, David Cott 50.
All right, DC, we'll catch up with you next week, and roll tide.
Roll Tide.